When it comes to the discourse of contemporary cinema, cinephiles are always split into two opposing groups. They are the old heads that tend to complain that cinema is dead, and then the newer wave of cinephiles that contradict this claim by refusing to watch anything from before the 90s. Both arguments have valid points. However, abstaining from certain films based on prejudice against time periods is bounding your perspective and opinions in a bubble, and ultimately closing you off to new experiences that might broaden your horizon and understanding of film. So, to prove both sides wrong, here are my list of recommendations for both the old heads and the newcomers. Our current era of cinema has gained itself an infamous reputation for being considered the worst era in cinematic history. This is attested by the expansive amount of contemporary films ruthlessly panned and the lack of popularity and rare amount of actual quality films. The majority of people contributing to this critique are audiences that long for the traditional era where classic masterpieces were being released at the same rate as the divisive films being released now. While many judgments have their share of films to certify said points, I think there are exceptions to these stereotypes of modern cinema. So, if you are one of these people that fall into this category of loving the old but deploring the new, here is my list of films to counter every possible argument you may have against the state of today's cinema. There are numerous films that debunk this myth, but some notable ones that might suit your more sophisticated, classic taste would be Requiem for a Dream, Donnie Darko, Children of Men, The Master, and Tar. All films borderline as mainstream, but they also incline towards niche audiences that prove that trending wasn't a concern of theirs. However, their high acclaim and appreciation from the majority prove that quality storytelling can exist with popularity in this day and age. I could confidently argue that there are current films that might be perceived as such, but they can do all these things effectively. However, to counter the statement, I'll recommend various films that deviate from the stereotype entirely, such as Moonrise Kingdom, Banshees of Inisherin, The Worst Person in the World, and After Yang. I will also suggest that you watch some romances that veer away from any excess use of nudity, such as Punch Drunk Love, Phantom Thread, Past Lives, and Amelie. The grandiose nature of cinematography has definitely increased over the years, hence the surge of cinephiles and filmmakers alike to highlight and even prioritize it over actual storytelling. However, to broaden your perspective on this, I am going to recommend ostentatious cinematic films that use their distinct visuals to support an already well done film. These would be Synecdoche, New York, City of God, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But I will also recommend some films that are just as monumental storytelling wise, but approach cinematography much simpler: Moonlight, Bones and All, and Polytechnique. There is a lot to complain about today's state of cinema, but I think the lack of personality in storytelling is one of the weaker arguments. If you truly believe this statement, then I urge you to look harder. Here's where you can start: Love Exposure, Swiss Army Man, Poor Things, The Tree of Life, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, Fallen Leaves, and Titan. Granted, there has been an incredibly disappointing decline in quality of universally beloved films. However, I still think once in a while we gain a film or two made for the masses that are just altogether excellent, enjoyable, and entertaining, such as Gladiator, Little Miss Sunshine, Coraline, La La Land, and Dune. From indie filmmakers like this year's spotlight Sean Baker to bigger scale directors such as Denis Villeneuve, great directors are scattered across contemporary cinema. Instead of fixating on individual films, one-hit wonder filmmakers that direct it, get into these modern filmmakers' filmography first. Damien Chazelle, Terrence Malick, Sofia Coppola, Yorgos Lanthimos, and Paul Thomas Anderson. The last unequivocal film movement we've had was the rise of indie filmmaking in the 90s, and ever since, the popularity of the style has only risen with its quality. While many commercial films still rely on trendiness to seize the media's attention, there are still many films out there that preserve the genuine nature of heartfelt cinema. Films like The Florida Project, The Before Trilogy, Mommy, Beautiful Boy, Licorice Pizza, The Holdovers, Come On, The Fablemans, A Real Pain, and Aftersun. With the rise of streaming services and short attention spans, dialogue has become more and more descriptive and simplified. But there are still exceptions that range from heavy focus but ambiguous and effective dialogue to films that are borderline silent. These films can be Lost in Translation, Enemy, Perfect Days, How to Have Sex, A Ghost Story, In Bruges, The Father, and Close. There is a stigma around classic cinema being pretentious or too old fashioned. Many come into older cinema intimidated by a number of reasons. It's too slow, it doesn't look polished enough, it's inflated, it's corny, melodramatic, and so forth. And while there are a handful of films that fall victim to these stereotypes, there is still a myriad of films that discredit every possible argument. After all, there's a reason why so many of cinema's timeless classics come from the older eras. So, if you are one of these people that fall into the category of loving new films but nervous to watch some old ones, or can't seem to tolerate the product of its time quality, then here are some recommendations to help cater towards every concern you may have about the historical films that made the very cinema you know and love today. Seeing my share of both old and new films, I'd verify that films post 2000s have significantly more issues with its pacing as opposed to those being released pre 90s. I presume people have this skewed opinion on older cinema because of its visuals and intimidating factor, and not on an actual basis of inability to stay focused because of its pacing. So, to motivate you to see older films that can well utilize their runtime, here is my recommendations. Alien, Dog Day Afternoon, Annie Hall, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Charade, The Apartment, and Rear Window. Another reasons why many assume older cinema is slower when it really isn't is because back then they were more focused on concepts and themes than actual sequences or actions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are no good films that mirror modern cinema's thirst for things to always be happening. You can begin with these films: House, All That Jazz, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, The Exterminating Angel, High and Low, Rosemary's Baby, and A Face in the Crowd. As said before, because cinema today has such a heavy emphasis on cinematography, it conditions us to believe unassuming, simple, or concise visuals equate to trivial and uncreative, which evidently will lead us to believe that old film look is outdated, displeasing, and ineffective. I asked those who believe in this statement to watch films like Apocalypse Now, The Holy Mountain, Barry Lyndon, Suspiria, La Ventura, The Night of the Hunter, Paris, Texas, and The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. These films are not only visually stunning, but they also deviate from that grimy, boring, old cinematic stereotype, and they also influence the very cinematic look of today's films. From Sound of Music to Star Wars, people seem to forget that with every era of cinema comes a large chunk of commercial films that were created to be universally enjoyed by everyone, and that specifically prioritize entertainment over extremely stylized and highbrow artistic choices. These films can range from just family friendly fun films to commercially constructed dramas and thrillers, and even horrors. So, if you want something accessible and easily enjoyable, then watch these classics: Jaws, Rocky, The Exorcist, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Sunset Boulevard, 12 Angry Men, Stand By Me, and The Wizard of Oz. When cinema was first created, melodrama was the only form of expression. Exaggerated performances and storytelling was all the industry really knew, but they evolved as time went on, and some great examples of realism in older films are Chinatown, Badlands, Kess, the Apu trilogy, The 400 Blows, and Once Upon a Time in America. It's a common misconception that traditional cinema means melodrama. Watching these films, you will start to see the grounding roots of realism in both performance and storytelling. As previously mentioned, melodrama was prominent in classic cinema, and though I'd like to argue that many films with theatrical performances and quick, unrealistic dialogue can be just as great as the films that cater to the subtlety you've grown accustomed to, I do understand why watching these sort of unconventional films might take you by surprise. So while I do urge you to try and watch and try to tolerate these dramatic, golden age-esque films, here are some films that deviate away from it and might suit what you're used to. Jean Dielman, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Days of Heaven, A Woman Under the Influence, Cleo from 5 to 7, Raging Bull, Cinema Paradiso, Dead Poets Society, and The Conversation. It's safe to assume that history comes with a large variety of problematic media. Back then, the concern of being politically correct was non existent, so there were many films that would be offensive portrayals of very sensitive topics. Culture and society has since significantly advanced, so one can conclude that many of older cinema's themes and stories are not relatable and even uncomfortable. But there are films celebrated as classics because they have defied the standard by standing as timeless and even ahead of its time in both innovation and in theme. Films such as Ali, Fear Eats the Soul, A Clockwork Orange, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Army of Shadows, Come and See, Full Metal Jacket, Do the Right Thing, and Videodrome. So, there it is, a list of films to discredit any of your excuses to avoid specific eras in cinematic history. While each part of cinema has its stereotypes that might intimidate you and might even be true, just know there will always be exceptions that might change your prejudice against it entirely and might even become your future favorites. It's important to keep in mind that there will always be a reason for every bad aspect of each era. Modern and contemporary cinema may not have been just as mind-blowing or original as the past, but that's because every story, every style, convention has already been established or told. And as for traditional and classic cinema, it may be a little bit unpolished, but that's because they were just starting out and they were trying to establish the standard quality, the standard rules and conventions of filmmaking. So don't close yourself off to any category, any time period, any movement that comes with cinema, because it's been here long enough to have a film and maybe two for every kind of cinephile or movie watcher. It's just about researching and finding the right one.